Welcome to this week's edition of Chatting the Pictures. So, Michael, our first segment we call the news, and here we ask, how do news photos tell a story?
This shot was taken by Hamad Mohammed for Reuters. In the photo, we see a Saudi Arabian defense spokesman displaying remains from the attack on the Aramco oil facility last week. I guess we can say that it's not your father's war anymore. The U.S. is supplying billions of dollars of weapons to Saudi Arabia, and after the attack, it was pretty clear that those heavy-duty weapons proved worthless against these new powerful drones and small cruise missiles.
This photo to me is such a great example of what I might call the rhetoric of display. Clearly, the goal is to tap into that idea that seeing is believing. It looks like almost like a museum exhibit, doesn't it? You have the platforms on which the artifacts are displayed. You have the cards marking each platform, describing the hunks of twisted metal. The velvet ropes you see in the foreground, which, it's like, don't touch the art. And then the spokesman himself, who looks almost like a museum docent. In other words, the interpreter of all of these artifacts. This photograph is fascinating.
Yeah, and I think that what you're hitting on there is how much propaganda has moved into the social media age. War now is as much based on pixels and on persuasion and making your case as much as it is something that gets accomplished on the ground. So we've got quite a marketing presentation going on here.
I kept thinking of a visual analogy from 2003 when Colin Powell gave the famous presentation to the United Nations that got the US involved in Iraq. And there it was the PowerPoint presentation that served as visual illustration and visual argument for what ended up being an erroneous series of pieces of evidence, right? So the maps on the wall behind, however this whole scenario ends up playing out, what really strikes me is I think you're right, that we're in this age where you can't persuade unless you're doing it visually.
On that presentation point again, I do think that some of these changes have crept up on us pretty fast. And I think that you can see that both in the new technology that Saudi Arabians have to contend with here. And then you can see it also in Senate hearings where there's all kinds of visual aids now. There's different screens and they have clips prepared. So, we have to both be prepared to consume and also contend with that kind of barrage of visual information.
Our next segment we call The Look. And here we are interested in thinking about how photographs push the visual boundaries to illuminate a story or an idea.
This photograph was taken by John Moore. He's certainly no stranger to us and to Chatting the Pictures. He took this picture for Getty Images. And what you see simply is a Border Patrol agent capturing a mother and a daughter from Ecuador in a Texas cotton field.
The initial impression I get from this photograph is really driven by the canted angle, that offset angle that Moore is using to capture this scene. It really visually cues you very quickly, something is off here. If you imagine the background of this photograph as perfectly horizontal, the action of the Border Patrol officer seems more straightforward and more rational. But that's not what Moore is showing us.
There's a number of things that I think strike you a little bit more subliminally. One is how much it calls up the trope of Black slavery. Moore is making a very powerful linkage here, of course, but the loading in terms of, what it calls up, to me is really powerful, especially because the current border battle is not about policy or economics. It's more about demographics and xenophobia, and ultimately, given the Trump agenda, about white nationalism. And that's where this photograph then makes perfect sense in terms of calling up this very, very familiar and loaded trope of Black slavery and the cotton field.
Couple other things I want to say about this photograph. There's a real irony being depicted in the photograph of people being captured in an agricultural field, which is itself a space where so many migrants have come to work and try to earn a living, and they've escaped to the United States in order to be employed. The second thing is this is also a man, a woman, and a child. If you think of that kind of beautiful triangle of the man above potentially protecting the child, the mother with her hand holding the child's hand. But again, that's not what's happening here. And there's a number of other photographs at Getty from the series he made. And he photographed the mother and child in particular, turning over their money to be held until they are processed, being fed sandwiches. So what is interesting to me is that there's this kind of very dramatic image that we see here. And then immediately this woman and her child are processed the way cotton itself is processed.
That's amazing.
In this segment we call The Pick, we're interested in what makes a photograph get public traction.
So this was released by Barack Obama on a couple of his different social media accounts. He released a photo of himself fist bumping with the young climate activist Greta Thunberg in a meeting in New York. The photo was used to cross-promote the Obama Foundation. In Obama's tweet, he said something to the effect of how much Greta embodies the vision of the foundation. So I think that context was not completely lost on me, but you're the visual presidential scholar, Cara, and why don't you jump into this?
Think of all of the images you saw of Obama in the Oval Office meeting with activists. And I'm thinking in particular, there's a photograph of him meeting with Malala Yousafzai, who at the time of their meeting was a young activist as well. Just the existence of this photo kind of captures or connects to that visual history of Obama interacting with young activists and promoting them and his relationship with them. What really hits me about this photo is two things. First, Barack Obama does not need the Oval Office trappings to draw people to him, and that's the clear thing. Thunberg did not want to meet with a climate denier. She did not meet with President Trump, but she met with Barack Obama. He retains a kind of moral authority, regardless of the fact that he is no longer sitting in front of a fireplace under a portrait of George Washington. Along those lines, I'm really struck by the very kind of ad hoc office space that they're standing in. And, like we all have that kind of one lonely, half dying plant in the corner of our office. The fact that he is meeting a climate activist in this extremely nondescript space, I think highlights that. Like, not only does he not have the trappings, but it kind of seems like that might not even really be his real office. The only clues are the paintings on the wall.
Well, what about the electric cord? I think the electric cord is there on purpose, actually. I really love your point about Malala and the White House photography and how Obama's got so much jet fuel to play forward so that we can get a photograph here that's done on the fly that's kind of a crap photograph. The lighting's terrible. It puts Obama sort of in the dark. The chairs are askew. I mean, it's a complete mess, but in some way he transcends, but then also still picks up the cool by making something that's just such a snapshot, something that just so got taken on the fly. I think he's built up that much cred, actually.
If this had just been them posing and looking at the camera or shaking hands or hugging, I don't think this photo would have gotten the kind of public traction that it has gotten. So then the question is, what is the fist bump? And the fist bump to me is really a peer-to-peer interaction. That Obama fist bumps her in this photograph says he's treating her like a peer. He is not looking down at her and saying, oh, look at this sweet little girl who thinks she can change the world. He's looking at her with respect. And the fist bump is kind of a way to say, hey, I really support you. I think you're doing a great job. Way to go.
For it to be such a sign of cool at this point, and also a parody between two important figures, is really fascinating. In recognizing her, in being together and putting this out himself, and then also doing the fist bump, he's really saying how much celebrity and the commodification of the leader is a necessary ingredient these days for social action.
Well, I think that does it for us this week. Thanks. We'll see you soon.
Take care.